Patricia sat up in her bed as the morning sun struck the heavy curtains guarding the window from whatever lurked outside, leaving streaks of filtered light on her quilted comforter that her mother made for her when she was just a child, which now lay stretched over Patricia. Travis was just entering the room the couple had been sharing for 45 years and noticed his wife was barely waking up. He stopped at the doorway and just gazed at his beautiful aging wife. She was just as beautiful to him that day as she was the day they met. "Travis," Patricia said with a hint of sadness. "He was here again last night." Travis stepped into the room and sat on the bed next to Patricia, floorboards creaking under his gentle footsteps. He took her hand and kissed it as he sat on the bed next to her. "That's the third time this week." Patricia's eyes got wide. Had it really been this many times? She thought hard about it and realized her husband was right. This made her even more concerned. "What was it I called him?" Travis, concerned as well, hesitated to indulge Patricia in her terrible hallucinations. "The sleeping man." Patricia seemed to fill with fear over the sound of it, and Travis could see the hair on her arm raised to attention. "The sleeping man. He doesn't like it when I call him that." Travis was a patient man, especially since his wife had been diagnosed with dementia 6 months prior. "How do you know that, honey?" "He told me." "Why do you call him that then?" "Because he always has his head down and his eyes closed. He looks like he's sleeping." Travis just let her talk. He didn't correct her nor interrupt her. They say that isn't a good idea for those with dementia, but he hated seeing his wife deteriorate before his eyes, helplessly. If you're new to Twilight of Terror, consider subscribing to the channel. I write and narrate all my stories, and I have so many more to make. You won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to it. Travis and Patricia had been in denial that there was even anything wrong with Patricia for about a year, but there was no denying it anymore. Travis wished she could just snap out of it. This whole thing was new to him, and he really didn't understand any of it, but he was learning quickly, the hard way. He knew she couldn't just snap out of it, but sometimes it was getting to be too much to handle. She was progressing quickly through the stages. He remained patient and calm, though. Patricia had been forgetting simple things for a while, nothing too alarming. Her grandson's birthday, what she had done on certain days when asked. It wasn't until she started talking about the tall, thin man in all black showing up in their room that Travis really started getting worried. At first, the sleeping man would show up in a corner of the room, maybe once a month, leading up to Patricia's diagnosis. She didn't say anything right away. Maybe she misunderstood a normal shadow in the middle of the night. The shadow would sway as if a piece of hanging fabric was being pushed by a small draft, back and forth, side to side, even curling up at the bottom ends, showing it wasn't standing on the floor. But then it started moving after a few appearances, beyond the normal swaying motion. The appearances became more regular every couple of weeks, and after a few visits it would start getting closer. At least, this is what Patricia thought she was seeing. When she started telling Travis about it, it was already standing in the middle of the floor at the foot of her bed at night, and remaining there until morning. Travis had had enough. He wasn't mad at her, but thought there was definitely something wrong with Patricia by this point. So he took his wife to her doctor for an evaluation. When Dr. Thorne examined her, it was clear that she was in the middle stages of dementia. Thorne had known the family for a long time. He had delivered Patricia and Travis's son 25 years prior, and then their grandson years later, and had been the only physician in their town of less than 500 people for the better part of that time. Even though they had their diagnosis, it still wasn't enough to calm Patricia when she saw the sleeping man. He terrified her. He just stood there, mumbling in a low tone with his head hung low, arms slumped at his sides, swaying disturbingly. Dementia or not, this was real to Patricia. She knew Travis didn't believe her, and she knew her condition may have come with hallucinations. But this was no hallucination. Not to her. Besides, there's no guarantee the sufferer would get hallucinations. The sleeping man was real as far as Patricia was concerned. Travis kept his calm demeanor. I wish you'd wake me up when he appears. I want to protect you. Really, he just wanted to show her there was nothing to be afraid of, in a way that was a way to protect her. I try, Travis, but I can't move when he appears. Travis kissed Patricia's hand again. What do you mean you can't move? I don't know. It's like I'm paralyzed. I can't move. I can't scream. I can just lay there with my eyes open. Travis was really confused now. Then how does he get mad at you for calling him the sleeping man if you can't talk? He hears me during the day. He's always here. This unsettled Travis. Always here? Patricia sighed. Never mind. You just think I'm crazy. Did you bring some tea up with you by any chance? This is often the way it would go. Patricia would go on about the sleeping man until she got tired of talking about him or Travis seemed annoyed. Then move on to something else unrelated. This time it was morning tea. She didn't really like tea, but Dr. Thorne thought it was a better idea than coffee. When Travis became too frustrated, he would go for a walk, not too far away from his wife, just up the road a block or so and back. And he was never frustrated with Patricia. It was always at the situation. But he couldn't show her that it was getting the best of him. When she was in this state, he wouldn't dare leave her alone, no matter how frustrated he was. Travis knew she had good days and she had bad days with her dementia, and he knew not to leave her alone on bad days. But the bad days were becoming more frequent. Talk of the dark entity she called the sleeping man was a sign of a bad day ahead. That day, Patricia was up and about, doing minor chores to help her feel some normalcy. She knew she had dementia, but tried to stay as active as possible, and she really didn't understand the depth of her illness. If she would get confused, she would sit in front of the TV and watch her favorite programs on repeat. But sometimes she didn't realize she was having an episode. This day, Travis had been in the basement doing laundry, and Patricia was in the kitchen making a snack. The late winter sun was beginning to set, and it cast an orange hue throughout the large bay window of the front of the house. Patricia liked a lot of sunlight. It kept her from feeling like she was a prisoner in her own home. As she made herself a sandwich, she had her back to the open floor plan that led to the front room. From there, she could see the orange and red light projected on the wall in front of her from the glass-filtered sun. She looked up briefly, and a black shadow of a tall, thin man was pressed onto the wall just to her right. Slowly and silently, the shadow moved along the wall toward her. The loaf of bread she was holding fell from her hands with a fearful flinch, making a thudding sound on the kitchen floor. Patricia turned, hoping to see Travis's own body blocking the sunlight, but he wasn't there. No one was. Even more afraid, Patricia ran to the edge of the vinyl-covered stairs and listened. She could hear Travis loading the washing machine from the top of the 13 stairs that separated the couple. She turned to look at the wall again, and the shadow had now moved again, as if to follow her. She called out for Travis, but the fear inside her had constricted her vocal cords, and only a whisper was released. So she descended the stairs and kept her eye on the walls as she thrust herself into the lower level. It didn't follow, but she could see the shadow perfectly formed on the wall directly above the front door behind her. As Patricia reached her husband, Travis saw that she was crying. "What is it? What's wrong?" he said gently with a caring voice. "He's here, now. The sleeping man, I saw him." As she pointed up the stairs at the wall above the door, Travis craned his head to get a better view around her, but there was nothing there. "In the day? I don't see him, Patricia." Patricia turned around, and surely enough, the sleeping man's shadow was gone. "I swear he chased me from the kitchen. A shadow." Travis didn't like to call attention to the hallucinations that he knew came with Patricia's affliction. In fact, he never spoke of it. The less he drew attention to the effects of her horrible illness, the calmer she would remain. Well, He's gone now. Stay down here with me when I'm finished loading the washer. We will go upstairs together." Patricia nodded her head quickly, still with tear-stained cheeks and watery eyes. She had never seen the sleeping man in the light. It had always been in the dead of night. She was even more terrified than she was at night. This meant she was never safe from being stalked by this whatever it was. When Travis finished loading the dryer with the previous load of clothing, he held Patricia's hand and ascended the 13 stairs with her. She was cautious, taking each step carefully as if not to wake a sleeping animal. Step by step, nothing appeared. Not on the walls and not on the main floor at all. Travis escorted his wife to the couch and sat next to her. After Patricia had calmed down in front of her favorite shows, and Travis read a few chapters of his book, he asked Patricia if she was tired. He could see her eyes losing focus and her eyelids struggling to remain open. Patricia nodded, and the two left the living room and headed down the hall to their bedroom. It didn't take long for Patricia to fall asleep. With the restlessness the night before and the scare she had in the kitchen that day, she was exhausted. But Travis stayed awake. He wanted to watch over his sleeping wife. Maybe he could make her feel safe if she had another episode. Laying in the dark with only a glint of moonlight peeking in the window and the dull light from his cell phone lighting the pages of his book, it didn't take long for Travis to get his moment to shine. Within 30 minutes of Patricia falling asleep, he felt her body jerk. He looked over and her eyes were wide open, staring upward at the ceiling. Her eyes were moving, tracing something. Tears filled her eyes and poured down the sides of her face into her curly salt and pepper hair. He pointed his cell phone's light upward, but there was nothing there that he could see. As Patricia lay in her bed paralyzed, she watched as the dark figure strode from his usual spot at the end of the bed right up to her bedside and brought his face down to her own face. So close he was almost touching her. He raised his finger, which looked like black leather stretched over bone, and put it to her lips and cocked his head as if to study her. The foul smell consumed Patricia's senses, as if rotting meat was just under her nose. She felt the wind from his inaudible words as he mumbled in a low guttural sound. Not human, but not animal either. Travis began tapping Patricia gently, not shaking her. It was crucial to not startle her. When there was no response, he had to try something else, something more extreme. As she lay there unmoving except for her eyes, he shined his flashlight on her. There was nothing there. Patricia lay silent, terrified, knowing what she was seeing was real, feeling the sleeping man's finger on her lips as he regarded her curiously. Travis was feeling helpless, desperate, so he rose his head from the bed and got above Patricia from the side. His eyes met her wild gaze with his own troubled stare. Her eyes grew wider as she watched the sleeping man vanish into a light mist. Then the trance was broken. Patricia wrapped her arms immediately around her husband and pulled him close, crying into Travis's shoulder. The nightmare was over for the moment. She didn't know how to explain what happened. Travis knew what she thought she was seeing, and it was getting worse. Patricia knew she had dementia, but she didn't know the severity, as that knowledge was kept from her to reduce the episodes of panic she may have. Dr. Thorne was very specific when he told Travis that he was not to tell her how bad she was. No asking her to remember certain events or people, as this would cause frustration. The best thing to do was treat her like normal and keep her comfortable. This wasn't a problem for Travis. He loved his wife dearly and wanted nothing but her happiness. His frustrations came from being helpless to her condition. He had always thought he could fix any problems she had in the past. But now, that was all gone. He could only protect her from the outside world and presumably her hallucinations of the sleeping man. After a year of this, Travis was growing tired, not of his wife, but physically exhausted. Neither of them were really living, and now Patricia was forgetting where she was and even who family members were when they would come to visit. She was seeing the sleeping man on a daily basis, sometimes 2 or even 3 times a day. Travis was always up late at night watching over Patricia and up early in the morning to make sure she didn't get up and wander out of the house. Sending her to a facility was not even in the question. This was her house as much as it was his, and they both loved the house and planned on passing away in their home eventually. But this was getting tiring. The exhaustion was taking its toll on this aging man, and it was starting to show in his gaunt cheeks, ashen tone, and heavy gray in his beard and short hair. He was so exhausted, and he knew Patricia was too. Lack of sleep and the emotional trauma that came with watching his wife disappear more and more every day was tearing him apart. His heart was breaking slowly, and he had no way to express it. But in this year, Patricia had become mostly docile, having moments of panic randomly when she became frustrated with not knowing where she was or who people were that she should remember, even her own husband. She was becoming a stranger in her own home more and more with the passage of time, yet she was still calm. One morning, Travis had to run to the grocery store. The visit from the in-home nurse was there to help relieve some of the pressure from Travis. 3 days a week, this woman would come and take care of his wife so he could feel a bit of normalcy. So, a trip to the grocery store suited that purpose, even if just briefly. Mrs. Fenton was a young nurse, barely married for over a year. Her age was ignored due to the gentle nature she nurtured Patricia with. Often she asked about her son. Nothing jarring, mostly just asking what he was like and how he was doing. Some days Patricia struggled with the details, and even remembering she had a son. But Mrs. Fenton wouldn't press and would change the subject. It was her way of seeing how her condition was progressing. The two would sit at the dining room table and chat like they had been best friends for years, and sometimes Patricia believed they had been, often calling her by an old friend's name, Dina. On this day, the two gossiping women sat at their usual spot at the dining room table and worked on a puzzle they had been building for months. Patricia was telling a story of her childhood where she and her cousin would get into trouble with an old farmer nearby. Suddenly, Patricia stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her eyes grew wide and tears started to form in her eyelids. Mrs. Fenton looked up from the puzzle and saw Patricia staring. Not at her, through her. She asked Patricia what was wrong, but Patricia just stared. The young nurse turned around and saw nothing there. She had heard stories of the sleeping man from Patricia and Travis, but was never witness to any of the sightings. Patricia stared wildly through her caregiver as she saw the dark shadow rise from behind Mrs. Fenton. Pressing a finger to his dark, crusty lips as if to tell Patricia not to say a word. Patricia just stared, crying. The nurse turned around again, but there was nothing there still. Slowly, Mrs. Fenton got up from the table and went around to Patricia's side, touching Patricia's shoulder and her back. She was saying something, but Patricia couldn't make it out over the horrible low guttural tones the sleeping man was murmuring. His head bent to the side, eyes closed. Patricia felt like he could still see her as he raised himself on the table onto all fours and slowly clambered his way toward Patricia, one hand and one leg at a time, moving slowly. Patricia's face was now streaming with tears, and her eyes were following the sleeping man's movements along the table. Mrs. Fenton saw her eye movement and tried to match her stare, with no success, until a single piece of the puzzle moved, ever so slightly, and surely unintentionally by the dark entity. His head still crooked to the side, his groans becoming louder to Patricia. The nurse hurried to the puzzle piece and picked it up, inadvertently and unknowingly placing her hand through the black spirit's leg. He stopped. Then he was gone. Patricia's trance was broken instantly as she collapsed to the table head first. If it weren't for the quick reflexes of her nurse, Patricia would have broken her nose on the table. Patricia slowly rose her head, her blue eyes meeting the nurse's own green eyes. Tears cascaded into Patricia's cheeks, but she seemed not to recall the events of just a moment prior. "You're beautiful, Dina," she said to Mrs. Fenton. The nurse had so many questions, but could only get out one of them. "Patricia, was that the sleeping man?" Trying not to show her own fear. Patricia's nonchalant way of forgetting the event was just an act. "Yes, he was here, on the table." To Mrs. Fenton, this was acknowledgement enough. This was real, not the ramblings and hallucinations of someone with dementia. Not long afterwards, Travis stepped into the front door and made his way to the two women at the dining room table. Mrs. Fenton was standing next to Patricia still, with her hand on her back. Travis sat the two bags of groceries on the floor and rushed over to them. He saw Patricia's eyes had tears in them, and it concerned him. "What happened? Is everything okay?" The two women looked at the worried man, and Mrs. Fenton was the first to speak. "Everything is fine. I have to leave," as she picked up her belongings and walked quickly for the front door. Travis could see her scurry into her car and speed out of the driveway and down the street. "What was that all about?" Travis asked Patricia. Patricia regarded her husband with confused eyes. "Dina is afraid of the sleeping man." Travis scratched the back of his neck. "He was here again?" Patricia just nodded. The next home visit came with a new nurse. This one had to be brought in from another town. A stout, older woman with grayish hair pulled back in a bun began with rules for Travis. "Be back by no later than 5:30 sharp. Do not discuss dementia with the patient. Do not interrupt her while she is caring for Patricia." Simple rules, but stern nonetheless. Travis was taken aback by this only slightly. She didn't seem like the warm presence that Patricia had grown accustomed to with Mrs. Fenton. "What happened to our other nurse?" Travis asked with a hint of disdain in his voice. The woman's eyes narrowed. "I'm not at liberty to discuss your previous caregiver." This made Travis nervous. If it were something as simple as finding another job or being reassigned, there would not be a need for secrecy. The nurse stared at Travis with hard eyes. "Are you going to do something else now?" "That's a hint." Yeah, Travis didn't like this woman who called herself Olivia. He figured he would complain to her supervisors after she left, but there was something sincere about her. After seeing how Patricia really enjoyed Olivia, he decided against it. A year went by and Patricia slipped further into her illness. She was forgetting everything by this point. For a while, she had called Olivia by her old friend Dina's name, but that passed, and she became confused as to who this stranger was. She was forgetting wedding anniversaries and even Travis's name. She recognized that he was someone important, but didn't know how. Travis had bought a cot to sleep in so he could stay in the same room as his wife and not startle her with a stranger in her bed. If Travis was tired and frustrated before, he was now utterly broken-hearted. But he continued being the support his wife needed, watching over her at night as the sleeping man would bring her to a paralyzed wake. The dark entity was getting bolder and not scaring away as easily as he had in the past. Sometimes it would take upwards of 30 minutes to bring Patricia out of her trance. But for the brief moment she was snapping back to it, she remembered Travis and held on to him tightly. It was all the assurance he needed that his beloved wife was still in there. Family and friends stopped coming by for visits. Even their son and grandson didn't make many appearances. It was too hard for them to see her this way, and she didn't remember them anyway. When they were around the high energy of their grandson, it frustrated Patricia and made her angry, oftentimes lashing out at the strangers. But she never lashed out at Travis. He was her savior against the dark spirit, if nothing else. Travis had never experienced the sleeping man, but he believed he was more than just a hallucination. Olivia had become a trusted member of the house and even lightened up quite a bit after she explained to Travis that the sleeping man wasn't a figment, but rather an apparition. She had seen him, And this wasn't the first time. She had at least 3 other patients that this happened to, and each of them have passed away. But Patricia's case was more extreme. The sleeping man was everywhere she was all at once, and Olivia could see him. By this point, Olivia had moved in with the couple to give Patricia round-the-clock care. The nighttime was something Travis kept as his own, but Olivia was there in case of emergencies. Then, one night, things changed. Travis sat up in his cot watching his wife sleep. He saw her jerk and her eyes open, like clockwork. Every night around 11 o'clock this happened. He watched as his wife lay motionless, following whatever this was with her eyes. Patricia had no more tears to shed. This was so normal that it didn't scare her anymore. Patricia watched as the sleeping man crawled up from the foot of the bed to her, hovered over her, moaning, grumbling. Travis ran over, but the trance couldn't be broken. He shook his wife, tried to get between her and the demon haunting her, but nothing. The sleeping man put his leathery fingers to Patricia's forehead, and her eyes went dark, lifeless. Travis burst out of the room calling for Olivia. Awakened from a deep sleep, Olivia stumbled into the room, tying her robe in front of her as she witnessed the sleeping man rising up into the ceiling, holding the hand of Patricia's own spirit. Only now, the sleeping man was all white. Patricia watched as the monster she had been terrified of turned from all black to a heavenly white. He spoke to her. "You see me how you want to see me. It's time." She felt her essence slip from her body, and as she did, she saw Travis and remembered him. She remembered everything. She was sad to leave her husband, but suddenly felt the exhaustion he had felt for so long. She watched as Olivia rushed to her side. She wished she knew more about the woman that was there for so many times. Then, she was gone. Travis stood on one side of Patricia as Olivia checked her vitals. "I'm so sorry, Travis. She's gone." This hurt Travis deeply. How would he go on without her? But at the same time, he was relieved that she was out of her misery. This had been no real kind of life for her the last few years, but he would give up anything to have her back in his arms. The next night, after a long day of paperwork and death certificates, Travis lay in bed holding her pillow tight against his chest. He could still smell her scent on it. The whole day had been a surreal blur. Reality had not completely set in. He felt the loss, but it was all like a dream, all alone in the house. Travis finally drifted off for a few minutes. In that short amount of time, Patricia appeared to him in a dream. She was in all white and was glowing with a brilliant white light. "You're going to be all right, Travis. We'll see each other again soon." And she was gone. He awoke immediately with tears already staining his face, but with a sense of calm. There wouldn't be a day go by that he didn't miss Patricia. No moment passed where he didn't think about her. But he knew this would be temporary. A year later to the day, their son stood beside Travis laying in his bed and watched as his father drifted off into his forever sleep. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. No AI has been used in creating this story other than images. If you did enjoy it, go on and hit the subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment. I have so many more stories in the works, and it'll be exciting to see how my stories evolve. As always, stay weird.